welcome everyone to our first Conversation with Friends event of 2024. This is actually the first event that we have hosted since the summer of 22, and we're really thrilled to be bringing this series back. It's exciting and enriching, and we're so glad to be able to be in community with all of you this way. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Anna Wyeth. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement. I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get into this evening's conversation. I want to encourage everyone, if you feel comfortable, to keep your video on. It certainly helps us feel the full participation of everybody who's here. I also want to encourage you to change your Zoom name to include your full name and how you're connected to the school. So if you're an alum, add your class year, perhaps you're a parent of an alum or a faculty member, current or former, or current family. You can think of it like your virtual name tag, just so we can all see who else is in attendance with us tonight. And it just helps us to know who's here. I'll also ask you to keep yourselves on mute just to minimize disruptions. We'll save asking questions until the end of the conversation for our dedicated Q&A portion a little bit later. So throughout tonight, if you have questions, please feel free to send them to me, Anna Wyeth, in the chat feature, and we will be happy to ask your question on your behalf. Or if you'd like to ask it yourself, just let us know that when you share your question, and we'll let you know during the Q&A when it's your turn to ask. So now, finally, the real reason we are all here tonight, our featured speakers. I'm so happy to introduce you to Meredith Fineman, who's the class of 2005. She is the founder and a writer who has worked as a publicist, personal brand expert, media trainer, executive presence coach, author, ghostwriter, and strategist. She's also collaborated on books, launched public relations campaigns across industries, and helped thousands feel good about accomplishments, particularly women in positions of power. She's an author as well as an influencer and voice in sustainable fashion, writing about, speaking about, and consulting about the power of secondhand fashion in today's environmentally conscious world. Leading our conversation with Meredith tonight is Lory Ivey Alexander, class of 1997. Lory is a contemporary visual artist, lawyer, and writer living here in her native Washington, D.C. Best known for her multi-layered, vibrantly colored paintings, Lory's major interests are Black Americans' identities and memories. Most especially, her work explores the intersection of Black, Indigenous, and white American stories and bears evidence of the artist's hand and the environment in which the pieces were made. In 2023, some of Lory's artwork was acquired by Washington, D.C., by the district for the city's permanent collection. And when she's not making art, Lory is an assistant director at the Consumer Protection Branch at the Department of Justice. Lory, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away. You're muted, Lory.
Why do I keep getting muted? What's happening? What's going on? All right, so I'm back. I'm really excited to be here tonight and really just invigorated to discuss both the book as well as the practice of writing and, going from an idea to publication. Meredith and I first connected as we were doing business and sort of professional coaching at the same time, sort of side by side. And I had actually just read the book. So I was cheerleading the whole way, and we've been trying to pull this talk together for some time now. So very excited to have this conversation. I just want to get started first by getting an idea of, what brought you to bringing this great message to all of us. Obviously, we'll talk more about what bragging, sort of means and that kind of thing. But why was it so important for you to bring this to the public?
Yeah, I want to say I'm thrilled to be here among this community and as well with you, Lory, and really genuinely honored that everyone took the time out at their evening and obviously Lory too. And it's so lovely to reconnect with someone in the Sidwell community and then be able to talk to them more extensively. So this topic is important to me because I ran a public relations firm. And then I had always simultaneously, I wrote a lot at Sidwell. I then became a freelance writer, actually my senior year of high school. And in terms of my voice, I was really able to not only parlay that into some of my career, but also feel comfortable in those public spaces and sharing those things. And I noticed that a lot of folks around me, particularly women or non-traditional voices, really struggled with that. And it was the inverse of the people who should feel comfortable. There's a lot of imposter syndrome that is, or rather the topic of imposter syndrome, feeling like you are either not qualified to be doing what you're doing, or you are just a big fake and everyone's going to find out. It's very similar to the themes that I work with in terms of it's the wrong people who feel unqualified to talk loudly, and also in our media landscape, which especially over the past 5-10 years has gotten even more egregious in terms of volume and voice not matching substance, and truthfulness, and sort of people being qualified to speak on those topics. And so it was really important to me to help people who, as I say, have done the work. My audience is called the qualified quiet, people that have done the work but don't know how to talk about it. Someone once suggested to me, and I was annoyed I didn't make it into the book, but that the other group was called the lackluster loud. And
I love that.
I hope that I'm just gonna take that. And you haven't had time to consult a copyright lawyer. So so that's something that's just really important to me, and championing other people's voices in general, which is, I would say, a tentpole of Sidwell's values, and really being able to do that for others comes much more easily. But doing it for yourself is also a very important skill in career and otherwise, just about things you care about.
Sure. Sure. So we've talked a little bit about this, but for the rest of the folks on the call, I've been in management in various capacities for many, many years, and I really truly try to be a champion of the people who are coming behind me, and part of, I think, good management is teaching other people how to toot their own horn, right? And to do so unashamedly, and to recognize that when you are sharing what you can do and what you have done, you really are giving a gift to the person who's receiving that. And part of that, making it a gift is how you deliver it, right? It's with confidence and all of these different things, and being truthful, right? And so one of the things that really resonated with me in the book was the articulation that bragging is truth telling, right? And so I'd like for you to expand a little bit on what bragging really means for you, and how it shows up in the book, and kind of how that is about telling the truth or sharing one's truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think that anyone inherently is in a position of power to use their voice, no matter if you manage 10 people, one person, or yourself, or you're starting out in your career, or you're way down the road in your career. It's very, very important to model those behaviors, because you actually don't know who's watching you. And that's really, really important. And if it impacts one person who's like, oh, she's talking confidently about herself, that's something that I can do. That's super important. But yes, the concept of truth. My parents who are on this call, my dad as a writer, when I would define bragging better, I would say it's stating true facts about your work strategically and cohesively to advance your goals. And he said, well, isn't true facts redundant? And unfortunately, in the times we live in, it's not. And so we have to sort of contend with what that language means and what it means for the future of truth, for the future of accuracy, for the future of journalism. Certainly in the past 2 weeks, that has been challenged a lot by media layoffs and a certain challenge to truth with social media platforms like TikTok, just so much misinformation, so much disinformation, and the attention economy really threatening a lot of those things. But when it comes to sort of speaking your truth and a commitment to truth, that is so important. Brag is an incredibly unsavory word. It there were a lot of options for me, and I wrote into the contract for my book that they could not change that title. Many people told me it was a bad idea to use the word. And I decided when you own language, you win. And I decided to redefine the term instead of trying to find some cutesy phrase like, hype yourself up better, or hype yourself up, or toot your own horn I never liked. And so I decided to redefine that word as stating facts about your work strategically and cohesively to advance your goals. And so what I always want to be very clear to people about is that bragging is simply stating facts. You've done that work. It's not untrue. It's not embellishment. It's not lies. It's not misinformation, disinformation. These are things that need to be shared, and they need to be shared for purposes of your work, but also for the purposes of the people you work with. If people don't know what you do, they can't help you, but they also can't help themselves. They can't help an organization. They can't help a cause, because people are not going to take the time out to know that. And I talk a lot about the flattening of that with a digital platform, a virtual platform, where if I don't say, or if you don't say exactly what you're doing, someone can't tell. There is no more happenstance. There's no more stopping by someone's desk or running into someone. There's some, but we spent 3 and now almost 4 years in a situation where we didn't have casual acquaintances. And so that's something that's really, really important to do. But more than anything, it's about an adherence to truth. And once I frame it in that way, I think it makes it a little bit easier for people. The unsavory word is to get your attention, because that's the industry I'm in, and that's something I'm good at, is grabbing attention. But then it's, what do you do with that, and how do you proceed?
Right. So one of the things that I find really interesting is you said that brag is an unsavory word. And I do think that there is, it has a little bit of its own baggage, right? But in a lot of ways, when women and people who have oftentimes, been sort of marginalized or put in positions where they're not able to shine, when they speak, even just, I'm able to do this, right? Just very minimal levels of bragging, they are further silenced, right? And so I'm curious to know your take on a phrase that you mentioned earlier, which was the idea of what's it called? Imposter syndrome, because I think that there's a flip side, I guess, to the idea that brag is an unsavory term. I think that imposter syndrome likewise is somewhat unsavory in that oftentimes people who are experiencing what we call imposter syndrome are actually people who society has actively or is actively telling you are unqualified, right? You should not be telling us what you are able to do. So I'm just curious about that, sort of language and what you think about that term.
Yeah, so this idea, imposter syndrome, which I'm sure most folks in here have heard of, but I always want to redefine, is, this idea that maybe you're bad at your job or you're unqualified for your job and you're just pretending and everyone will figure that out. To some degree, a lot of the human experience is just pretending, but that's different from being good at your job. And it's very linked to this idea of being afraid to talk positively about your work or brag or however you want to couch it, which is that it affects the wrong people. So I tell people this idea, this fear that you're bad at your job is usually not a fear of people who are actually bad at their jobs. And every single person says to me, what if I brag too much? And I said, well, that level of self-awareness usually means you would be physically unable. I'd be very surprised if you were able to do it. So I think that, though, I'm not going to pretend, and I say this very much in this book, I feel that very passionately this way about professional development books, that the onus, we always say for, anyone who's a non-traditional voice, which is to say, a white man, is that, oh, this is you. If you are a little bit more ambitious, if you brag a little bit better, if you nix your imposter syndrome, if you X, Y, Z, break a glass ceiling, that a lot of the onus is on the individual, which is a problem in American culture. And I would say, I am not going to pretend like this is in a vacuum, like there are not serious systemic issues. And it's how to play in a broken system. which is very important to point out, and your ability to be heard and your acknowledgement and your voice being acknowledged is inherently intertwined with privilege and the messages that are coming at you from a variety of angles. So I'm always really clear. I'm like, this is not going to solve the wage gap. This is not going to cause, change systemic racism. However, I will say, like, if you are someone that people listen to, it's part of your job as a person in society to pass that mic, share that mic. At the most selfish, it just makes you look better. There's a lot of research around it, makes you look more generous, more charitable, more, inclusive. So at its most self-serving, you can think about that. But yes, there are a lot of silencing. I contend that not that it's a lose-lose. I don't like saying that, but I think that it is something that people are going to talk no matter what. You can't control people's opinions and perceptions of you. So I would rather you swing for the fences in this way than stay silent. That's what really makes me nervous. What makes me nervous is when people see someone. So to take a step back, we all know someone who is less qualified than we are, or gets more recognition, whether that looks like professional recognition, community recognition, personal recognition. And you're like, wait a minute. I know way more than that person, or everybody feels this way probably in our respective industries. And so what I get very nervous about is that instead of figuring out a way to do this that feels okay to you, is that you choose silence. That's a much more dangerous option to me, and I believe to society at large. So that's what I would say. But there are tremendous forces at play that tell you your voice doesn't matter. And I believe you should try anyway.
Fair enough. So if we think about people who, I think a lot of people are just uncomfortable generally with talking about themselves, right? It's not just going so far as to, explain what accomplishments one has had over even for, performance reviews, right? Like very simple things. People are really, they've been taught early on, unfortunately, they've been gotten to, if you will, very early on, that talking about yourself is, a negative, right? That it shows self-centeredness or, any variety of narcissistic qualities, even to the point of, pathological, right? Like negativity, right? So what do you say, or how do you encourage people who really just don't know how to begin, where to begin, right? Obviously read the book, but where to, right. But
available wherever you get books. I feel like the Truman Show. It's like available wherever you can get your Nest.
What do you say to those people who just are uncomfortable even beginning that conversation?
Yeah, well, I would say a couple things. You're so not alone in this difficulty. There's a reason why my book continues to sell. This is such a pain point and an uncomfortable thing that my publishers were uncomfortable with my using the name. And I said, no, people are going to, relate to this and feel it. And I've met thousands of people. I started talking about these concepts in 2013, which is 11 years ago. And some people recoiled, but every single person I talked to, honestly, the more senior I got, the people were more afraid of it. So I would say you're so not alone that I've written a book and have a business doing a lot of these things. I do a lot of corporate speaking, particularly around performance reviews. Writing about yourself is very difficult. One thing I think that Sidwell does very well is create great writers, but let's talk about how there's a language problem. There's a writing problem here. So you should know how to do these things, but you also don't particularly have a vocabulary for them, which is why I was forced to use a word like brag. I would have preferred if I didn't have to, but the language around these activities is super duper limited. So that part takes practice. And it's also, you're not really trained to do this, and it's a more recent work skill that's necessary. I mean, it always has been, but it was never the sort of thing where, and I primarily advise in professional situations. I am not someone who's going to tell you how to live your life. That, I've been asked that in varying interviews, and I said, if you want to extrapolate this however you would like, you can, but I'm sticking in the career domain. But this is a skill at work in the way that there are other skills, in the way that you have a practice. It's something you absolutely have to practice at. And what I tell people is it's PR, not the ER. It's, if you fall on your face, that's okay. Everybody's big question to me is like, what if I do this wrong? And then you say, hey, I was trying a thing, it's important for me this year to make sure that I am talking about my work for purposes of, doing a good job. Like, can I try that again? And nobody's gonna be like, no, you're not hurting anyone. So like, let's take a step back there and talk about the stakes. And I want to make sure it's, to say it's important work and I'm proud of my work, but like, let's talk about the stakes here. Like you will be okay if you do this not perfectly, and you're going to have to, it takes some practice, but there is a language issue. I wrote the vocabulary to talk positively about your work because it doesn't exist. Somewhere along the line, we were told that you could not use I in a sentence, particularly at work. And as I said, this is a newer phenomenon. Previously, if you worked at a large company, the idea that you would ever talk about yourself individually, or the idea that business leadership, we've always had that in the history of American, commerce and infrastructure. We had the Rockefellers or people like that, that were parts of big industry, the Ford, but it was not the sort of thing where you would step out and be an individual as a leadership of company and drive business. We now have the cult of personality, for better or worse. It's come out that some of those people are crooks and actual criminals. But that is, particularly I work a lot in startups, and when you're fundraising, a lot of the questions of venture capital firms is how magnetic is the leader? How much are they going to drive business? So let me reel that back, which is to say that you don't have a vocabulary for this, which is why as a writer, I am uniquely qualified to create that. So this idea that you are not supposed to say I in a meeting, it's grammatically a mess, which we will ignore, but you can, when talking about your team, use I and we in the same sentence. Like every single Sidwell English teacher is having a conniption right now, but like, you can do that. You can say, we did a fantastic job as a team. I'm so proud of X and Y and Z. And personally, I was able to do this specific part. And, I know it contributed to a great work product. So that's what I would say. But this stuff is very anxiety provoking for everyone. And my work wouldn't exist if it weren't. So it elicits that in everyone. And if you just want to start by like saying a great thing you did to yourself, or you call a friend, or you say it to your pet, like that's fine too. You're not like jumping in like this. I mean, that's a bit much.
Right. I actually think that also, one of the things that I tell people is to practice, like kind of come up with some language, say it to yourself, feel what it feels like in your mouth to use these terms and figure out how tooting your own horn, what that looks like for you, because it is different from person to person, from circumstance to circumstance. For some people, it is more, I want to share this information. And for others, it really is like, I'm great. And this is why, and there's nothing wrong with either of those things, So I'm curious, you talked a little bit about, being in a team environment or like, in the workplace. How do we apply this to people who are, let's say you're, used to, putting your information or your work out in a group setting, but you're publishing a book, right? Or you're going out on your own in a podcast, right? Or whatever that forum is, but where you're going from that we environment to that I environment, and you need to put your information out there. You need to be able to get comfortable for the first time in making that transition. How do you bridge that? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And just to dovetail on something you said before, what are your goals here? Like, if you were like, I am killing it, I don't really, whenever I work with anyone, coaching, consulting, blah, 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 what visibility goals do you have? And then let's work backwards from there. If you're like, I want a promotion, I want a new job, I want to stand on a stage, I just want to be able to say this to a friend. I want to go to a family gathering and feel confident in my career. Like, no matter what those things, figure that out first instead of this like, I gotta acquire this whole new skill and then like work back from there. So as I said, this idea of an individual promoting themselves, particularly within a larger organization, was never something that was important to a company or even allowed by a company. Certainly up until the last 10 years, if not the last, 5, 6, 7 years. So it is to the advantage of your organization to have folks promoting their work, but also then by proxy being representatives of your company. I think that, being at a company and promoting a book, I could do a whole other conversation on book promotion as I do every day and have, but I think that it's important to figure out your goals, and also it's a fine line, and that's okay. You might like fall over the line, you might face plant on the line, and you'll figure it out. Like, you have to try those things. And as I said, it's PR, not the ER, and really understanding the stakes here. But also asking your colleagues, to promote your work, including them in it, I think is great. There are always going to be people who have big feelings. There's this like primary school teacher who I guess she's on TikTok, but I see her on Instagram, and she always says, she's like, oh, you say to someone, to like de-escalate, like, you're having a big feeling, which is like what she says to like 5-year-olds. But people are going to have big feelings about some of these things, and then some people are going to support you. So figuring out who can help support you, and also how it can help, especially with like tempering with an employer and saying, I want to be sure to do well by the organization and speak to the organization's goals, as well as be a strong representative of the company, because you don't want to be in a situation where they're like, wait a minute. So that's important to do. But then also when you have a life, you're a whole person. And I think that that's something that we're contending with, particularly in the workplace at the beginning of 2024, is how are you bringing all the different parts of what you're interested in to your work? And if it's a personal project, I mean, Lory, like, you're a painter, like how, I mean, you're interviewing me, but like, melding those two things in your interests and saying, I'm a creative person and this is what makes me better at my job. And this is why I want to talk about this. And this is how these two pieces of myself intersect. I think that when you do go on a podcast, people want to see your whole self. And I believe, whether they mean it or not, that your employer will say that they want that too. So this sounds a little conniving, but I don't think they can really say otherwise. If you say, I'm here to, make a good impression for the company. And obviously you care about promoting your employees' voices in other mediums. And then they're like, so that's how I would spin it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So I do want to talk about the book and getting from, idea to a physical object that you can hold up in your hand. But I also want to talk or have you talk a little bit about in the actual workplace, how do we tell the story of ourselves in annual reviews before we move? Yeah, because I think that's a big piece of this that we haven't, we can kind of dance around, but it's really difficult for many, many people, even just literally writing the chronology of these are the 10 things I accomplished this year, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I would say the two corporate speaking topics that I do the most are annual reviews, and then usually like International Women's Day or Women Voices at an organization. So I have a couple coming up that are around annual reviews, and I know they're scary. Evaluating yourself and writing about yourself is very scary. And so what people do is they wait until the night before or 2 nights before, and I've been on the phone with those friends and we're writing it at 2:00 in the morning. And I'm like, okay, well, you're a professional, so I'll write this for you, but I want you to learn next time. And then inevitably the next year we're doing the same thing. So a speaking coach once said to me, I mean, the truth is when something makes you anxious, you want to leave it to the last minute. And, she and I called her early and she's like, you're going to be so excited to give this speech. And I'm like, you're out of your mind. Like, I don't want to do this. I'm doing it for a bunch of money. Like, we're just going to like power through. And that's relating to this, not what you want to do, because the more consistently you do it and the earlier you start, the less anxious you will be about it, which feels a little counterintuitive. But for anyone that is going through this, I would say 8 to 10 weeks before, start thinking about it, but don't be like, not a lot of pressure. Put 20, 30 minutes, 20 minutes in your calendar and say, okay, I'm going to write down a couple wins, or I'm going to write 2 sentences about myself. Fine. 2 sentences about what I'm up to. You have many different practices. We all do of things we do and things we like to do and things we practice at. So I would say every week I tell people to put 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes in their calendar and write down a couple wins, because recency bias, which means that we remember things most recently, means that there could be tremendous wins that happened 10 months ago and you're not including them in your review. So just getting into the cadence and the habit of that, I think, is really important. And then you're able to look back. One thing I do this so late in every talk or whatever. Bragging better is a team sport. This is a team sport. You don't have to do any of this alone. Nobody said you have to do it alone. Nobody said you have to figure it out alone. If I worked with you, for example, I would say, hey, what are a few things you saw me do this year that like you thought were cool? Like, it's incredibly easy for us to downplay things that we're very good at because they come naturally to us. Like Lory, I would be like, I think it's unbelievable that you're able to interpret something on a canvas in the way that you are. Like, I don't even understand that. And you're like, well, that's what I do. I'm an artist. Like, I don't understand. Like, that's just what I do. But it's important to have that frame of reference. So certainly when it comes to annual reviews, like buddy up with someone, do them together and say, how would you describe me? How would you describe a win of mine? And then see how you can use that too. Like I have done that. I've done that with friends and say, okay, this is how I see you. This is how I see your work. That's really important to do. But start earlier than you want to, buddy up with someone else who this is hard for. And, even if you're like, okay, I'm going to answer this question for you and you're going to answer this question for me. And then you say, okay, I'm going to take 2 sentences of that and then add 2 sentences of my own. It can be a group project. Like this, you don't have to do any of this alone. I didn't get to any of the writing I've done, any of the work I've done alone. Like that's, what do they say? If you want to go fat, I'm going to mess that up. But it's like the going fast, going alone, etc. Like the point is, if you want to do something well, it's going to have to include other people for many, many reasons.
Sure. I think that I was just struck by the idea of creating a brag book, and then I realized this is the brag book we're talking about. No, but I used to tell my staff members to create what I call a happy news folder, just on their desktop or in their Outlook, where they save when people, give them accolades, when they go to trial and they get a win, when, whatever those little moments, because not only is it something that they can go back to when they're preparing for their review or looking for, some sort of advancement, it's also a folder they can go in when they're getting ready to give a talk, when they're going into a training, when they're just having a really crappy day and they need to remember who they are, right? And you can go in, like, sort of go through, like, oh yeah, that's me, right? I think that it is important not only to be tracking these things throughout the year, but also to really have them in front of you so that you can go back as you are preparing, right? As you are doing that recap or that synthesis at the end of the week or at the end of each month, but also to kind of glance back, right? And go, okay, in June, not only did I hit my numbers, but I got this feedback from someone I've never worked with before who was just like, I couldn't have done this without you, or whatever those things are. I had a junior employee tell me, like, I love that you have a it's called like Happy News Indeed, and she was like, I'm going to start that. And I was like, I always tell people, you need to have that. And so we started calling it the Happy News folder. But I think that is also a great tool. I do want to use the time that we have left to talk about the book and the book process, right? So I know that you've been, you came up with this idea a long time ago, done a lot of speaking on it. Tell us about how did you get to the book, right? Proposals, just give us the roadmap.
It was a long one. And it's funny because you can't tell anything necessarily on social media, or people have perceptions of who you are, and then that's who you are. And I contend with that a lot with Brag Better. I'm talking here about how people present themselves and how to present a shiny package, but it's also how to be a whole person. And that isn't always something that can come across because it's not 3D. So it was a long struggle to publish Brag Better. I first came up with the idea in October of 2013. I went through a bunch of agents on it. I shopped it in 2015 to unparalleled interest, and then nobody purchased it. Nobody made an offer. So typically in publishing, you query someone to read it, and then they decide if they want to bid on it. But there are like two asks. It's like, do you want to read this? Yes. Do you want to make an offer on it? Yes or no? And so when I was with that agent, it was 13 out of the 13 editors that wanted to read the proposal, which is very rare. But then nobody threw down ultimately. And that was just crushing. And something I'm proud of, but something that's also difficult, is I'm always a little bit early, and timing is the only thing that matters. And this was, pre-Trump, pre-Me Too, pre a lot of things around conversations around voice and visibility and things in the workplace. And so I thought it was dead in the water. I really did. And I thought I would sort of have to hang up the entire concept. In publishing, no's are hard no's, which it's not the sort of thing. Hard no's means that if it's a no, it's a no. And unless you present a wildly different or new project, the chances that it will be revived are quite small unless you're a huge name. So I speak every year at the United Nations Girl Up Summit, which is a wonderful United Nations Foundation Girl Up Summit, which is young women ages actually there was a 13-year-old this year, which freaked me out, but it's ages 16 to 22. I was like, where is your parent? 16 to 22. And they are very high flying young women that want to know things. I do a Brag Better talk every year, and there was this woman sitting in the audience, and I thought she was someone's mom, and her name is Kate Schatz, and she's written several New York Times bestselling books. Rad Women Can, Rad Women A to Z, about including important women in history. And she does it with an incredible illustrator. She was there to give a talk, and she said, "Had you ever thought about making this a book?" And I was like, I don't know that I can do that again. It was 2018. And then it was a really unusual process of how I then re-engineered that with her. And I wouldn't even let my best friend say the title. We didn't even say the title of the book. I was like, I cannot get my hopes up again in this way. I'm not even going to say the title of the book.
Sure.
We called it BB, I think. And that was it. I was like, we're not saying anything. I can't deal with this. And then I had an agent who was very passionate about it, and it was much more developed. It wasn't ready in 2015. It was 70% baked. Then it was purchased in 2019, and it came out in 2020. I wrote it pretty quickly. And then, it's a very long tail. Then it's 2 years. Now I'm at 3-4 years of promotion. And so it's a long game for sure.
Sure. So what advice do you have for people who maybe have a book in them, or have a really strong concept, but maybe don't have an agent, or have just haven't started the process? What is your what's your guidance?
Yeah, everyone has a book in them. That's a fact. Whether you end up pursuing it or executing it is a whole different bag. A couple pieces of advice. People get really caught up with the whole book. And they're like, I must write the whole book, and it's a bad idea. So I'm uniquely positioned to do proposals because I'm a writer, but also a PR pitch person. You're writing a pitch document. Unless you're writing fiction, totally different bag, could never do. Deeply admire people who write fiction. If you write fiction, you have to submit the whole book. If you're writing nonfiction, you submit a 30-page document. It's basically a startup. It's this is why I'm the person to do this. This is what the funding looks like. This is what the market looks like. This is a sample of what this is going to look like. Here's the kind of following I have. So I would just focus on a proposal. Agents, you have to ask a lot of people. I'm working on another book and I have bothered a lot of people about it. It's a lot of bothering people. And that's okay too. And it's, you know, a long tail, but focus on the proposal if you're doing nonfiction. You're going to have to ask a lot of agents and they're going to say no, or they're going to say busy, they're busy. Or my favorite was an agent who said that brag better was a good idea, not a great idea, which is an iconic burn. And I included that in the acknowledgements. Just an iconic burn. So it's a lot of no's. It's a lot of, you know, that's a bad idea. And I'm doing it again right now. And I'm like, maybe this is a bad idea. So you're gonna have moments of that. And so some people are gonna think it's a good idea, but not a great idea. And ultimately what matters is that you're gonna have to fight for that piece of art, because it's the intersection of art and capitalism, because it's hard, because, you know, and I'm like, I can't believe I'm doing this again, but it's like my art, like, how dare you give me edits? But like, you know, it's also business. It's a business. And so I tell people as well, if you're thinking of writing a book, to walk around a physical bookstore and think about where you want your book to be. I mean, part of this is also like, I want you to have a nice time and like write something you like and be proud of it. You cannot control the sales, which actually, if you have enough money, you can control the sales kind of, but like not really. So where do you want it to be? Like, what do you want it to look like? I have so many author clients who I'm doing, you know, varying consulting or press for. And the one thing I really drill in is they're like, well, pub day, I'm doing this and this and this. And I'm like, yeah, but are you gonna like have a party? You gonna like have a nice time? And they were like, well, I have this like branded event. And I'm like, no, like, what are you doing that's like nice and fun? This is a very hard, monumental thing to do. And you can do it. I mean, you've seen a lot of ding dongs write ding dong books. So like people ask me constantly, is this a good idea? Is it good? And I always say, I'm one person. I'm not here to judge that. I just want you to be proud of it. That's all ultimately that matters. But it certainly won't be as bad as some of the bad books you've seen out there. Like, let's be honest. And this like dovetails in everything. Like, there's some bad books and we don't know how they got published. I mean, there was a time in like the early 2010s where they were publishing like books of tweets. So I think that you can do this. It's hard, but I don't believe in the trope of suffering through this. I think that that's a fallacy, and you also don't do it alone. I've built teams of researchers or independent editors that I've hired. And so you also don't do it alone. It's not you sitting you locking yourself in a room. If you want to do it that way, that's cool. But I also don't think that's how you really execute a book.
Before we turn to the open Q&A, I did want to just touch on something that I heard you say in passing with regard to, you know, to writing a book. You mentioned in your pitch, referencing or including your audience, right? But also your following. So I was curious, in this world, basically, I worked at Beacon Press literally 100 years ago, right? Like back before having a following was a thing, right? You had a book idea, you got your book idea out there, right? But how much does that come into play with regard to, you know, getting a deal? But also, how do you pitch that I have this particular, you know, niche following, or I'm a micro influencer or whatever.
Yeah, I think that we're getting past that. So people ask me this every day. They're very concerned. Like, I have this book, I'm like, it's great. And they're like, well, I don't have a following. I think publishers are finally getting hip to the idea that a following does not equal book sales.
Absolutely.
I think that influencer marketers are finally getting to, not finally, influencer marketers are definitely, and people that work with them for varying campaigns and or their brands or whatever, are really realizing like size does not equal click-through, does not equal purchase. And so that is something that social media, like early mid 2010s, like the second you had a substantial following, they were like, yay, but it no longer is like that. And what I would rather someone be well connected and or part of large alumni organizations and or part of other large groups and clubs and access to newsletters and podcasts That's way more important. So what I'll have people that do that have very little social media is they'll say those are actually the wrong numbers to look at. You know, who do you know who has newsletters that have an engaged audience? Tell me their open rate, which is like what percentage of the people that get the emails open the emails. And who do you know who is part of a large alumni organization that will have a talk and will maybe buy some books or have people buy some books? That's way, way more important. And so people say, well, I'm, you know, part of XYZ, or I'm speaking at XYZ conference, or I'm connected to this, like, who are you connected to? Who are the people you're connected to? What do their audiences look like? That's actually a lot more important than building your own audience. Yes, you have to have like a, you know, personal website. You have to have like some semblance of stuff, but I believe that you should tack yourself onto other people's audiences versus trying to build your own. So people are like, well, I got to get more of a following before I do this. And that's not really true. So it's more about your wider network and how are you going to leverage that? And how are you going to look at other people you know that have written books, or other people who have audiences, which is much more important to tap into. And yes, you can have your own, but it's really, and this is true in any form of promotion, is yes, it's your audience, but who can be advocates for you? Because a lot of times that's also what sells books.
Mhm. Sure. All right. So I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Anna. I think we do have some written out questions from the audience, and then we might have some other live questions. Anna, do you want to go ahead and take it over, and we'll hear what our audience has to say.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much so far. This has been fascinating. We have a couple questions that came through our registration form, and a couple that have come through the chat. So I'm going to start with this one, which is one that came ahead of the event. How do you deal with peers or similarly leveled people in your organization who might become jealous of your self-promotion or success, especially if you are a young woman of color in an older white workforce?
How much time do you have?
Right?
How much time do you have? So this is going to happen, period. People are going to have those big feelings that I talked about. But we need to assess how much it affects your work and how much it affects your job. I remember coaching someone, and she had a very, very powerful boss who was deeply uncomfortable with self-promotion. So let's actually talk about, what do you do when either peers or people above you are not comfortable with this? You need to really assess how this might affect your job. It's not fair, it's not right. But the whole point here is to move your needle forward. And so if it's not moving the needle forward, then it's something to reassess. I am not telling you to blow through that anyway, because I don't want this to adversely affect you. I think that sometimes it's including those people. I mean, you can diffuse some of those situations, but also let's like talk about whose feelings are your problem and whose feelings are not your problem. And so one, is this affecting any area of what might advance you or what might have to do with your work? And you might have to have some of those conversations, whether these people deserve them or not, and say, hey, like, you know, I just want to check in, and I maybe this is totally me, but have, you know, just having a gut check about, you know, some of the things that I'm doing around my work and talking to folks around my work. I think sometimes that can really diffuse and put a pin, and those people might get defensive, but also they might be like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then they'll usually cut it out, or they'll say, yeah, I just think you're really full of yourself. And you could say, okay, well, you know, I'm curious about your feelings. And again, then you're taking care of someone else's feelings, but sometimes you have to do that. This is very real. And sometimes you might have to blow smoke up someone's butt that's like, you know, I think you're so good at this. Can you show me how to do this? I really admire you and your work. But that's extremely real. That is a huge reality. So I would say the first thing is to figure out if and how this is going to affect you. Now, there's some people who might say it will, and is that true or not? And I would also look at some of that feedback. People talk about getting negative feedback. And when you get that negative feedback, which like everything under the sun has been said to me, particularly about this work, is, who is this person? do they really care about my well-being, and do they advocate for me? Do I respect them? Is this coming from multiple trusted sources, or is this one person who feels like this girl is just too into herself and I don't like it? So I think really, really assessing that. And then also really creating more senior allies. So I am not a young woman of color. Let's just also put that there. So those are things that, while I advise on, I deal with the misogyny, but not the racism. So let's be abundantly clear there. And I think that that is part and parcel of being at a larger, whiter company. And I think that I actually wish I had better advice. And there's some really wonderful advice from folks that I carefully culled in the book. If that is a difficulty to purchase, you can get it from your local library. And I think that that's a really important thing too, because that is not an area of expertise. But I would say like that comes with a lot of the territory, and you might have to kowtow to more senior folks and make it seem like it was their idea, or, kind of ask for permission, but not really. But the jealousy piece is like, people are going to feel how they feel. I just want to make sure it's not impacting your work negatively. If it might stop you from getting a promotion or a raise or inclusion on a certain project, like that's something that we might have to reassess and say, okay, is this worth it here? And is this not? Ultimately, like, this is a skill that I want to improve your life and not impede things you want. But sometimes also it's a gut check about what you're doing and why you're doing it. But yeah, I mean, that is something that comes with a lot of this territory, unfortunately.
Yeah. We had another question that came through the chat. This is somebody who works. The question is, I work at a nonprofit called Suited for Change, where we are trying to impart these same skills to women who are struggling with various topics, from domestic violence to being formerly justice involved, and the battle about confidence is such a struggle for them. We've always suggested talking about skills that they have outside of the traditional work sphere, like being a mother, for example. For those that are less privileged and need a hand in even recognizing their worth within, how would you suggest they hit those first stages in bragging for themselves as they return to the workforce?
Yeah, so the first thing is I charge corporations a lot of money for me to speak so that I can speak for free at somewhere like Suited for Change. So please feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to do a free session there. And I'm also, as someone who does a lot in secondhand fashion, and certainly trying to help people, suits are a very difficult thing for people to find new homes for. So I would be more than happy to provide my services there. When you are in a privileged position, as I am, and certainly like being at Sidwell and having access and having people listen to you and feel like you're worthy of the type of education you're getting and the attention you're getting, is something that imbues a lot of these feelings. Like your background and your upbringing and what you're told about visibility and voice, and your voice deeply impacts those things. And when you are a survivor of some of these situations, that makes it very, very difficult. And you have to go back to what are irrefutable things about myself and my character that I can start with. Am I kind? Am I thoughtful? Am I a good friend? Am I a good parent? I think that's the place to start. Like, what are the things you know to be true beyond anything else? If you feel like a piece of garbage, you can figure out the work skill stuff later, but like, what are the irrefutable things about your character? And I think that that's a really great place to start for anyone at any place where something's hard. It's like, okay, things are distorted right now, but what do I know to be true? Which, from my understanding of domestic violence, is this distortion of self at the hands of someone else. And so I would say, what are things I know to be true, even though I am at this point in my life? What facts do I have? But like, more than facts, like, what do I know in my bones to be true about myself, even when everything else has been stripped away? There's obviously, the reason why you do the dignity piece in feeling the part, in looking the part, and then really getting towards the facts. And yes, like, it is a totally different game now. There are lots of skills. Like, Lory's saying how, what is your creativity? Why does that make you good at your job? And I'm sure that it does in so many different ways. Like you think outside the box, or are able to take very concrete ideas and make them abstract. Like there are lots of different ways. And yes, transferable skills, this person asking, being a good parent. I mean, that's harder than like writing a report. Like that's, from my understanding, I'm not a parent, but like that seems harder than like writing, like again, like pitching a client. Like, there's one of those is really a much more serious situation than the other. Like, let's be honest. Like, I think we're at a time where we're all reevaluating our relationship to work, but we have to work. So that is what it is. And work is dignity and is important. So that's where I would start. I think asking those around you, because you're in this distorted place, like, or the people that, at this at your organization, and saying, okay, I've gotten to know you. Here's what I know about you. And you might not believe that, but do you believe me? So I think that's where I would begin. But it is an extreme situation, and I'd be happy to help however I can.
Thank you so much. I know we're close to the end of our time. If you don't mind, I want to ask one more question that came through, which is how can leaders and managers encourage good bragging from their direct reports and the folks that are under them?
Super important. If you are in a position of leadership, encouraging this of your team. When I was talking about this a lot more in the Zoomosphere, depending on whether you're in person or not, like that's important to clock. But looking at the little boxes, because Zoom has a volume issue, in that it recognizes the loudest voice and then puts the box on that. So how can you see who else is in the meeting, who hasn't spoken, making sure everyone speaks. If there's someone who you feel like might have difficulty, say, how can I help tee you up? Can I ask a question? Can I toss something to you and make you look good? I think that's really important. People need your guidance there. So you should be modeling these behaviors. But also, making sure that people who don't speak up as much in meetings get that attention. And even if you say, like, let's start by us talking together and you're telling me, what your wins were this week, or my helping you find them, and then maybe feeling comfortable. There was a firm where I did a bunch of different coaching, and the head of the firm is an incredibly magnetic person who had no trouble speaking up in any domain. And she couldn't understand why there was someone very junior who had so much trouble. And, so this junior woman and I crafted one question, because she didn't speak up in meetings, which like didn't surprise me at all for so many reasons. So we had her write down like one question to ask. And she was like, well, people are going to know that I'm reading from it. I was like, well, you just look like you have notes. It looks like you prepared. Like I said, that, it looks, nobody knows what's written there. And so she would ask her question and read it out. And I say something like, based on my notes, I have this question. And then, like nobody knows that we've typed that up ahead of time. And then we would do it every week. And then she would only just carry it with her and not read it. And then she wouldn't carry it at all. So I think that that's something that also you can encourage. And maybe sometimes you tell people to write down things, like, you're all sitting there. It's like, oh, you know what? Let's start this meeting by all writing down something that we did this weekend, passing it to the person to the left of us, and like reading it out loud. Allowing people to do that in different ways. Like I'm sure there are lots of conversations, at Sidwell in the education sphere about, and this is true at colleges, about participation grades and, what that means and who's suited for that. So that's what I would just say off the bat.
I'm sure that we could talk for another hour about all of these things. But we are about at the end of our time. I want to say thank you to both of you for participating in this. And if you have any closing thoughts, happy to turn the mic back over to you.
I'm epically findable online. If you have any more questions, or you're with Suited for Change, or you're with a big corporation that I'm going to charge for a talk. So at Meredith Fineman everywhere. I just really want to thank Lory for championing my work so intensely, and for the Sidwell community rather, for championing that work and bringing folks together. I just, in a quick glance of the audience, I think it seems to be a diverse age group of alumni. So thank you for having me.
Of course. Lory, thank you so much for leading this conversation. Meredith, thank you for your incredible insight and candor. I know this has given me so many things to think about. I'm sure it's done the same for so many here tonight. We have 3 more Conversation with Friends events scheduled this spring, one next month, one in March, one in April. And I hope you will visit our website and check those out. I will drop the link in the chat in just a minute. But I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. This program doesn't exist without you all, without alumni and community members bringing conversations to us, bringing ideas, bringing suggestions of their peers and classmates who they think would be good to feature in one of these conversations. So if you have an idea for a future event, please reach out to me, to alumni@sidwell.edu, and let us know. And with that, I'm going to say thank you and good evening, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you to Anna for all of her hard work and organizing everything.
Thanks, friends. We'll see you all very soon.